A Texas couple's alleged decision to leave multiple children under the care of an 11-year-old turned tragic when a dog broke free and mauled a toddler to death. And now those adults are facing serious charges. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. On December 29th out in Wichita Falls, Texas, what should have been a routine babysitting arrangement turned into an absolute nightmare. There's no other way to explain it, because Deidre Wheeler and her husband, Lacharles Ramsey, are now facing multiple charges of child endangerment after apparently their Pitbull got loose and attacked and killed a 2-year-old girl that they were supposed to be watching. According to a police report, 911 gets this call from someone who was en route to the hospital with a 2-year-old child that had just been attacked by a dog. They told the dispatcher that the toddler was bleeding very badly, was unresponsive. Officers were flagged down at an intersection. The child was taken to the hospital, but that 2-year-old girl sadly died. And before we get into more of the details of what is truly an unthinkable and heartbreaking case, I got to bring in right now Paul Cannon. He's a personal injury attorney. He actually specializes in dog bite cases. Paul, thank you so much for coming on. I imagine you've seen some really horrific things in your practice. This case, particularly devastating. Do you deal with a lot of cases involving children who are attacked by dogs?
And thank you for having me on. Unfortunately, it's very, very common that kids wind up to be the victims because, who plays with dogs the most? And at the end of the day, dogs get out, they see kids running and they're smaller, and they often sadly become the target if a dog gets overly aggressive or even just overly playful, and it turns into something more dangerous.
Generally speaking, what's the liability responsibility in these cases? How does it work?
Well, so in the state of Texas, we are one of about 18 states that go by the one bite rule. Majority of states out there go by strict liability. When you own a dog, you're responsible for it. In Texas, you have to prove that the dog owner was aware that their dog had dangerous propensities and therefore make it an aggressive dog. And that can be that it was either bit someone in the past or that it had acted aggressively and attempted to bite someone in the past. And even though it failed, the owner's now on notice that the dog is an aggressive dog.
I want everyone to keep in mind what Paul just said about that, because as we advance this story and talk about the details, I think that knowledge component becomes key. So let's talk about what we know here. So an officer with the Wichita Falls, Texas Police Department spoke to Deidre Wheeler to try to find out what happened here. And she said she agreed to babysit this toddler and her 8-month-old sibling while their mother was at work. So Wheeler says she picked this woman up from a local shelter, dropped her off at her job, and then took the kids to her house where they would be watched by Wheeler's 2 oldest daughters, who were 19 and 16 years old. Now, Wheeler said that she and Ramsey were away from the home until about 4 p.m. And at that point, Wheeler told the investigator that she stayed home with the 19-year-old while Ramsey took the 16-year-old to an event. A little while later, the 19-year-old left, so Wheeler was at the house with the children. The police report reads, she stated at approximately 1700 hours, their pit bull broke out of its kennel. She picked up the 8-month-old child, and the pit bull then bit the 2-year-old sibling and began to attack her. She stated she handed the 8-month-old off to one of her children, and she began to get the dog off the 2-year-old child with assistance from Ramsey. She stated she was able to get the victim, and they rushed her to the hospital, but flagged officers down at Loop 11 and Seymour Highway. She stated she couldn't remember how the dog got out because it happened so fast. Okay, Paul, before I even get into some of the problems in the accuracy of this story, if those were the facts, if that was the actual fact pattern we're looking at, where she was home, this happened, and let's just say before we go further into the story that this dog had never exhibited behavior like this in the past, would she or her husband be facing civil liability? Would she and her husband be facing criminal charges?
So it's interesting because, I've read some stories that suggested that the dog had done this in the past, but under the circumstances, had it not, it falls into a problem area in the one bite rule of dog bite law, because the one bite rule basically says you've got to have knowledge that you have a dangerous dog. Now, there can be indirect knowledge as well. For example, Why was the dog in a cage? Why was it crated? Was it in there because they'd had issues before that maybe they aren't letting on? But let's assume it didn't. Then you're falling under the old school negligence. There is a scenario under negligence law where if you can show a dog that does not have abnormally dangerous propensities like that, is in a circumstance when a rational adult should be aware that there's a likelihood the dog could attack or bite someone, then they could still be liable. In this case, if you've got 8 kids running around a house, 2 of them older, but the 6 of them younger, they're making a lot of noise, that sort of thing, you could make an argument that there is negligence there, that they should know that this dog could get riled up and spooked, particularly with strangers in the house, and may or may not act aggressively under that circumstance. So it's questionable. There's a possibility there you go under negligence law, but under true one bite rule, the answer would be no. If there's no prior knowledge, there's no liability.
And I appreciate you breaking that down, because I haven't even gotten into the worst part, because apparently that story wasn't true. So the very next day, the officer gets a call from a CPS investigator who said she had information that neither Ramsey nor Wheeler were home when this attack happened. Yeah, so they gathered up the other kids to interview them about what happened. And it says, quote, through these screenings and forensic interviews, the children stated neither Ramsey nor their mother was home. They stated they were home and being watched by their 19-year-old and 16-year-old sisters from approximately 1220 hours until approximately 1600 hours, when Ramsey and their mom both took their 19-year-old and 16-year-old sisters to an event. They stated during this time, Ramsey left them at the house under the established care of the 11-year-old daughter while they were gone. Just process that for a second. The 11-year-old is now in charge. So according to these interviews, when this attack happened, there were 7 children in this house, ages 11, 10, 7, plus 6-year-old twins, the 2-year-old, the 8-month-old. Paul, this is a recipe for disaster. I think that's clear. Could you say, as a defense, the older children, 11 years old, we felt that this 11-year-old was responsible enough to watch the children and watch the dog. Is that a defense?
You can say that. The evidence sure doesn't seem to support it in this case. The interesting thing about this case is the prosecution has multiple avenues they can pursue this under. Because of the dog having a prior bite history, not only do they have the prosecution under the health and safety codes that establish what is effectively the one bite rule as it's codified, and the exceptions that it has based on criminal negligence. But they can also pursue this under a child endangerment type of cause of action, a criminal cause of action. And under that, my understanding is a child is defined as anyone under the age of 14, which means if I can leave an 11-year-old by themselves and that can be considered child endangerment, then putting them in charge of a bunch of smaller kids sure doesn't go well to saying this was a responsible thing to do.
So let me ask you a question, because the report says that this 11-year-old was actually cooking dinner or making dinner for the children before anything happened. That a factor that weighs in favor of these defendants now? Hey, look, she's taking care of the children. She's making them dinner. And that doesn't affect it, right?
Well, I think it all goes to the jury issue, and when you're trying and prosecuting this case, was it reasonable for them to leave this child in this position or not? Because anytime a child is in that age of anywhere from being about 6 or 7 on up to 18, the level of intelligence and responsibility can vary drastically. This one's right kind of in that middle zone where some might say, well, they're old enough to babysit. Others might say, no, they're not. And so I think that could come into play. But I think the real problem you've got here is, how did this dog get out of a crate or cage or whatever it was in? Obviously, it was not secure. And that's a big issue, particularly if there's a prior history of biting with the dog.
Let me lay out a little bit more details from this report, because I think it's important to understand exactly what we're talking about, how this went down. So the report continues. The 11-year-old started to fix dinner for the children and had called her mom to see when she would be back, because the children were getting out of control. Again, 11-year-old watching all of them. During this conversation, the dog then broke out of the kennel and they grabbed the 8-month-old, but the dog then bit and attacked the 2-year-old. They stated shortly after this attack started, their mom and Ramsey arrived back at the residence. So again, they weren't there, got the child from the dog and fled towards the hospital. And this is pretty egregious, because the police report says each child, quote, stated this dog had broken out of the kennel before, and he had also bitten their 5-year-old brother approximately 1 year ago. That's an allegation, but if that is true, Is that the end of the case here? How do you defend against it?
I think from a criminal defense perspective, you're in serious trouble here, because that's pretty hard. That's pretty solid evidence, both on a civil and criminal liability aspect, that puts you into the dangerous dog laws violations. The dangerous dog law has two basic rules. One is designed to address when a dog gets out and is off the property, but there's a second one that addresses just dogs that have bitten before specifically. And what it says is, if a dog commits unprovoked acts in a place other than an enclosure where it was being kept, if those acts cause a person to either reasonably evil attack, then you're dealing with a dangerous dog at that point. And this dog, if it's bit before, if it's got out before, if it's attacked another child before, clearly it's going to fall underneath that. It is going to be classified as a dangerous dog, even though it's not necessarily been classified as a state.
Right.
Once you have a known dangerous dog, you have an obligation to keep it under lock and key. And the enclosure itself has to prevent people from being able to get in, not just the dog from getting out. So even if a child opens the door and sticks their hand in, you're liable for that dog once it's a dangerous dog. In this case, we got a lot worse facts than that. I think you're looking at the criminal penalties, frankly.
Worse facts. Apparently they lied, because the investigator in the police report said that there was video evidence that confirmed both Ramsey and Wheeler left the home at around 4:15 p.m. They were gone for around 45 minutes. Didn't they suspect? I mean, if this is true, the digital evidence in every one of the cases that we cover, I don't know how you argue against it. And to say you were home when you weren't, that just adds another layer to this already terrible case, right, Paul?
Correct. Absolutely. But I think that is what really brings up the child endangerment and the reckless endangerment aspect of the case, the fact that they're out of the home, they're away from it. But the punishment phase under that is going to be a state jail felony, which is 180 days to 2 years. Whereas when you get into where they're probably going to be more like
children, right? I think Wheeler's facing a cruelty to children charge.
But if you get into the dangerous dog statute itself, now you're looking at second and third degree felony type charges that can be brought, which carry a much harsher punishment. So I think there, to me, is a greater concern for if you're on the defense side of this thing, because these people, it doesn't matter if they're home or not. They've got an obligation to secure that dog and keep it away from any kids getting near it, whether they're there or not.
I want to talk about those criminal charges in a second. I just want to focus one more thing, just to everybody process this. The level of responsibility placed on this 11-year-old child is just staggering. Not only was she tasked with caring for multiple young children, but now she had to deal with the presence of what is a known or allegedly a known aggressive dog. It is a burden that no child should have to bear. And I should tell you, I let everybody know, after the attack, authorities had made the decision to euthanize the dog. Paul, is that usually what happens in these cases? Is that usually what happens to these dogs?
So if the dog gets out and bites somebody and it's just kind of a incident where someone gets bit, but it's not necessarily a horribly aggressive situation, maybe, it could be mistaken as the dog just thought it was playing or something like that. They will look at it and usually someone from animal control will kind of evaluate the situation. They will a lot of times make sure there's insurance, make sure the person's warned that what the situation is, how they now have to take care of the dog, and they will release the dog back to the owner. But when it's a particularly aggressive situation like this, or there's a death involved, they're almost always going to take it away and put the dog down.
By the way, you might not have the answer to this, but I'm just curious. Not every dog bites. Why do you see certain dogs engage in this? Was this a situation where the dog was, not properly trained, and that's a signal of a level of responsibility and culpability here, or are there just certain dogs that can't be trained and that are always a danger? I'm trying to understand, having a pit bull like this. What do we see typically in these kinds of cases? Is it, if you're seeing dogs attack people, is that a situation, again, the responsibility of the pet owner that they didn't properly train this dog, or is there nothing that can be done?
Well, the reality is that any dog can bite. I've seen the smallest Chihuahua do permanent scarring to somebody's face because they looked down under the table to pick up something they dropped, and a dog happened to be under there trying to find food and reacted and bit. And all that comes down to the training, the understanding. Obviously dogs can have illnesses, mental illnesses, whatever, and that may prevent a particular dog from being good or bad. As dog owners, we have a responsibility to understand our dog, get it whatever training training it may need if it has issues or whatever, and learn how to handle it properly and be aware of what its inclinations are, what its issues are. If I've got a dog like this that I know it has gotten out and bitten people before, then it should have a solid lock of some kind on that crate, and it should be put up somewhere where nobody can get anywhere near it and not even get a finger in the cage.
Are pit bulls typical kind of dog involved in these cases, or am I unfairly discriminating against pit bulls?
So pit bulls a lot of times get more of the press when it happens because they are very strong, powerful animals, and they can do a lot of damage if they do get out there. But percentage-wise, I mean, there's a lot of other dogs out there. I think German Shepherds are the ones that most bites are reported for. There's a lot of different breeds out there that have been reported as well. So I think you hear a lot more about them. Doesn't necessarily mean they're more often than other dogs. It's just that that's what the media scene, they look for the worst stories to publish, I think.
By the way, we checked into their backgrounds and we found that both Ramsey and Wheeler have faced criminal charges in the past for forgery. So we were able to use TruthFinder, the powerful background checker, to find out a little bit more about Ramsey. All we had to do was put in his name and his profile popped up, including past arrests. And yeah, by the way, Law and Crime, we partner with TruthFinder. We use it to get details on people involved in our stories. But even if you don't work in true crime, this just can be an excellent resource to give you some peace of mind. After all, it's one of the largest public record search services in the United States. And with the paid subscription service, you can get access to unlimited reports about almost anyone. And right now, you can get 50% off of your first month of confidential background reports. Just go to truthfinder.com/LC sidebar. Now, Wheeler and Ramsey, they are facing the consequences of their alleged choices in this case. They were arrested on January 27th. That is nearly a month after this attack. Both have been charged with multiple counts of endangering and abandoning a child, plus Wheeler faces one count of injury to a child. Her bond was set at $450,000. Ramsey had a bond of $300,000. And the charges, you gotta say, reflect the severity of their alleged actions. Abandoning or endangering a child is a felony in Texas, punishable, as we talked about, up to 2 years in a state facility. The additional charge of injury to a child that Wheeler faces is even more serious. Our understanding carries a potential sentence of up to 20 years in prison. Paul, going back to what you said about the criminal charges, do I understand those penalties correctly? And could they be enhanced? Could we see upgraded charges?
Yeah, so generally injury to a child is considered a third degree felony, which carries a possible sentence of up to 10 years and a $10,000 fine. But there are circumstances where any kind of felony can be considered aggravated and or upgraded. If it gets upgraded to a secondary felony, then yes, you can get into that range of 20 years. So they could be facing some pretty serious penalties for this.
And talk about a lawsuit. Could we be seeing a lawsuit here? How would it work? Would it even be worthwhile if you're talking about maybe the mother of this 2-year-old filing a lawsuit? Is it worth it? Talk to me about what we could be expecting. They're not saying it's happening, but could we expect to see it, and how would it work?
Let me answer it this way. Yes, you could very easily see a lawsuit in a case like this. We handle probably 40 to 50 of these a year in the Houston area and around Texas. The reality of these kind of cases is there's a lot of investigation that starts out because it isn't hard to win the case. It's where do you find the coverage? Where do you find the insurance coverage? Because most people are what you call judgment proof in the state of Texas. You take a judgment against them, they just go file bankruptcy. It's cheaper to pay a bankruptcy lawyer $5,000 to file bankruptcy than it is to pay off a $200,000 judgment or whatever judgment you happen to get. This one could be millions based on what we're looking at damage-wise. First question comes down to, did they have insurance? Homeowners insurance is the first thing you typically look at in these cases, but a lot of homeowners insurance companies now exclude dog attacks. A lot of homeowners aren't even aware that their policy does not cover their dog, and it's because $650 to $750 million gets paid out every year in homeowners claims for dog bites in the United States, and the insurance companies are kind of like they're doing everything else in Texas. They're tired of paying for all the wind damage and all the hail damage and everything else because we have so much going on, and they don't want to keep paying for this, so they look for ways to write exclusions around it. You don't read the policy carefully. A lot of times it'll exclude your dog. It may exclude certain breeds of dogs, or it may exclude all dogs together. So if you find coverage, then you can bring the claim, then you can bring the evidence. And in this case, it seems like the evidence is pretty clear cut to me for liability. It's just a question of, is there going to be anything to pay that judgment when you're done?
Paul, a lot of the cases that we cover, the reason we choose to cover them is to kind of bring awareness to issues out there. And you have here penalties that definitely underscore the gravity of leaving children or allegedly leaving children unsupervised, especially in potentially dangerous situations, how the law recognizes that adults have a duty to protect children in their care, and failing to do that can have severe legal consequences. And we're putting a spotlight on this. Do you see a case like this maybe being a form of deterrence that will wake people up to not leave children unattended, particularly with a dog, and maybe give a second thought about how they're actually maintaining and securing their dogs? Do you see cases like this, stories like this, as a form of deterrence?
I don't see it as a form of deterrence because we see it over and over again. I wish it was a form of deterrence. I wish people would wake up and read this, but we all have a tendency to have that, oh, it won't ever happen to me attitude when it comes to our dog and it comes to our family.
That's the unfortunate part about this. Paul Cannon, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate you breaking it down for us. Really, really sad case, but enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that's all we have for you here on this episode of Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe here on YouTube or check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.